Hey there, everyone. This is Melissa Furness, and I'm here to chat with you this week about perspective. So, in the next kind of discussion, as well as a few demos, I'm going to be talking about perspective in art. So, what this is that it gives your work, a 3D look rather than a flat, like painting or drawing, something that's very unmodulated. It sounds kind of complicated and boring, maybe, but it's actually, quite simple, and it's probably something that you already understand, but just haven't really applied to your work or haven't really paid attention to. So just understanding perspective in art is really what makes your work look real and in proportion, and it gives a sense of space, of deep space. So learning how to use perspective really can add distance and will give depth to your painting or drawing and make it so much more interesting and realistic. So just as a really straightforward overview, perspective is a technique that enables artists to add the illusion of depth in a painting or drawing. So there are several types of perspective that I'm going to demonstrate in the upcoming videos that I'll be doing. But first off, I really think that you guys need a little bit of background because there's a lot of really interesting information and relationships between what happens throughout history up to the present day in regards to how artists deal with perspective and how they manipulate it. It's a lot of fun to work with, so just listen in. Okay, so to start to get an understanding of perspective, we need to start before perspective began. And so before perspective, paintings and drawings typically sized objects and characters according to their spiritual or thematic importance and not with distance. So especially in medieval art, this was meant, the art was meant to be read, as a group of symbols rather than seen as a coherent picture. So the only method to show distance was by overlapping characters. And overlapping alone made kind of poor drawings of architecture, which you can see here. Medieval paintings of cities are a bit of a hodgepodge of lines in every direction. So this type of art was called Byzantine art, and this was the art of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Christian empire whose capital was Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, which endured from 330 CE following the Roman Empire in the east until it was conquered by the Turks in 1450 CE. So the term refers more to a style associated with Byzantium than to its area. So Byzantine paintings and mosaics are characterized by a rich use of color and figures, which seem flat and stiff. The figures also tend to appear to be floating and to have large eyes. Backgrounds tend to be solidly golden or toned. And so these are intended as religious lessons, and they were presented clearly and simply in order to be easily learned. And just as an FYI, the early Byzantine art is often called early Christian art as well. So Byzantine art never really lost sight of its classical heritage. It developed out of the art of the Roman Empire, which was itself profoundly influenced by ancient Greek art. The art produced during the Byzantine Empire, although it was marked by these periodic revivals of a classical aesthetic, was above all marked by the development of a new aesthetic. The Byzantine capital, Constantinople, was adorned with these large number of classical sculptures, although they eventually became an object of puzzlement for some of its inhabitants. So the most salient feature of this new aesthetic that was forming was its abstract or anti-naturalistic character. So if classical art was marked by the attempt to create representations that mimicked reality as closely as possible, the Byzantine art seemed to have abandoned this attempt in favor of a more symbolic approach. The nature and the causes of this transformation, which largely took place during late antiquity, have been a subject of scholarly debate for centuries. So it was Giorgio Vasari that attributed it to a decline in artistic skills and standards, which had in turn been revived by his contemporaries in the Italian Renaissance. Although this point of view has been occasionally revived, modern scholars tend to take a more positive view of the Byzantine aesthetic. Alois Rigel and Joseph Strzelczyk were writing in the early 20th century, and they were above all responsible for the re-evaluation of late antique art. And Rigel saw it as a natural development of pre-existing tendencies in Roman art, whereas Strzelczyk viewed it as a product of more Oriental influences. Some other notable recent contributions to the debate include those of Ernst Kinzinger, who traced a sort of dialectic between abstract and Hellenistic, tendencies in late antiquity, and also John Onions, who saw an increase in visual response in late antiquity, through which a viewer could look at something that was in 20th century terms purely abstract and find it representational. So in any case, the debate is purely modern. It's clear that most Byzantine viewers did not consider their art to be abstract. So as one modern theorist observed, our own appreciation of Byzantine art stems largely from the fact that this art is not naturalistic. Yet the Byzantines themselves regarded it as being highly naturalistic and as being directly in the tradition of Phidias, Apelles, and Zeuxis. So the subject matter of monumental Byzantine art was primarily religious and imperial, and the two themes are often combined. So these preoccupations are partly a result of the pious and autocratic nature of Byzantine society, and partly a result of its economic structure. The wealth of the empire was essentially concentrated in the hands of the church and the imperial office, which therefore had the greatest opportunity to undertake monumental artistic commissions. So inverse or Byzantine perspective is frequently but not exclusively used in the painting of icons. So with this form of perspective, the viewer is the point of view of the objects in the icon and experiences multiple points of perspective. So the intent of using this form of perspective is to supposedly allow the viewer a window into the kingdom of God and to bring them into some sort of relationship with the Almighty. So this slide shows you distinctly those different types of perspective. First, we have linear perspective, which I will demonstrate later on in another video. This shows the vanishing point is located inside the painting. Then there's axonometric perspective, which is more of a neutral point of view. Out of the space, the lines of the object remain parallel and bring it closer to the witness. And then there's reverse perspective, which is what Byzantine perspective is. And the vanishing point with this is where the vanishing point is located outside the painting and on the viewer instead. So in choosing not to use the illusion of linear space, nor of external light and shadow, and by placing the point of perspective on the viewer, the divine, spills out over the confines of the frame and rushes out to embrace the heart of man, a human, I should say. So this form of perspective is very different from the perspective found in Western European art and challenges the culture's way of seeing art. So in this 14th century image, you can see the theological truth of the event as it kind of radiates out towards the viewer. So here, events that are happening within the buildings are placed outside, again going against linear perspective. And to indicate the action is happening outside, you see a red veil that is suspended between the tops of the buildings. And then you take a look and see that the foreground is indicated by the two bottom bands that tip the ground up and open the scene toward the viewer without giving the impression of linear depth. They are drawn either through inverse perspective or through axonometry. So in order to express forward movement. So this method applies also to the architecture that appears to be opening up and outward. So you can see here in this diagram how those are shown. This is inverse perspective, and this is axonometric perspective. So then we have the perspective of importance. Characters in the icon are highlighted based upon their importance in comparison to other characters within the icon. So those that are more important are larger and therefore awarded more space in the image, while those of less importance are smaller. So perspective perhaps, first entered mainstream artistic use around the 5th century BCE in ancient Greece in the subject of skenographia. And this would be using a flat panel on a stage to give the illusion of depth. So skenographia is a little bit less known, and it's very interesting. It was in Greece and Rome the art of scene painting, and was used both in the theater and in domestic and public buildings. So you can see here some of these images in actual houses that you can go and visit in Pompeii. So the philosophers Anaxagoras and Democritus worked out geometric theories of perspective for use with skenographia. Some of the paintings found in these ruins in Pompeii show a remarkable realism and perspective for their time. So keep in mind, here that perspective was invented nearly 1600 years later. So Euclid's optics introduced a mathematical theory of perspective. In its definitions, Euclid follows the Platonic tradition that vision is caused by discrete rays which emanate from the eye. So one important definition is that, things seen under a greater angle appear greater and those under a lesser angle less, while those under equal angles appear equal. So Euclid's optics is really the earliest surviving work on geometrical optics and is generally found in Greek manuscripts along with elementary works on spherical astronomy. It may once have been in the possession of Piero della Francesca, who wrote one of the principal treatises on perspectives in painting. So a clearly modern optical basis of perspective was given in 1021 when Alhazen, who was an Iraqi physicist and mathematician, in his book of optics explained that light projects conically into the eye. So this was, theoretically enough to translate objects convincingly onto a painting, but Alhazen was concerned only with optics and not with painting. So you can see here, conical translations are mathematically very difficult, so a drawing constructed using them would be incredibly time-consuming. So the artist Giotto di Bondone attempted drawings in perspective using an algebraic method to determine the placement of distant lines in the image. So here you can see his work and how it came across. And so the problem with using, a linear ratio in this manner is that, the apparent distance, if I go back to the other slide again, between a series of evenly spaced lines actually falls off with a sign dependence. So to determine the ratio for each succeeding line, a recursive ratio must be used. So this was not discovered until the 20th century, in part by Erwin Panofsky. So you can see here where it's almost right, but not quite. So there's some aspects that go almost to a vanishing point, but then there's others that don't exactly. So here we go and take a look at some of these other images by Giotto, and you see here, although the picture does not conform to these modern geometrical methods of perspective, it does give a decent illusion of depth, and this was a really large step forward in Western art. So this is one of Giotto's first uses of his algebraic method of perspective. So 100 years later, in about 1415, then comes Filippo Brunelleschi, who was a sculptor, an architect, an artisan engineer, and was given credit for the invention of linear perspective. So here you have him on the right, looking up at his famous dome that he built for the Duomo in Florence. And he also built San Lorenzo and many other structures as well. So in 1415, what he did to discover perspective was that he painted a picture of the baptistry on the surface of a small mirror, right on top of its own reflection. So to determine the fact that this painting was indeed an exact replica that could fool the eye, Brunelleschi drilled a small hole in the mirror and then stood directly in front of the baptistry, looking through the peephole to see the real building. He then held up a second clean mirror in front of the painted panel, and the second mirror blocked the view of the real building, but now reflected his painted version on the original mirror. So by moving the second mirror in and out of the way, Brunelleschi could check whether his painting was indeed an exact copy of the three-dimensional octagonal building on the two-dimensional surface of his original mirror. So once he had verified the accuracy of his painted mirror, it became possible for Brunelleschi to analyze the structure by which 3 dimensions were translated into 2 dimensions. And so it's really interesting because Brunelleschi was obviously a genius, but he was also very kind of full of himself in some ways and really wanted everyone to see all of his fantastic inventions. And so according to Vasari, he then set up a demonstration of his painting of the baptistry in the incomplete doorway of the Duomo. He had the viewer look through the small hole facing the baptistry. He would then set up a mirror facing the viewer, which reflected his painting. And to the viewer, the painting of the baptistry and the baptistry itself were nearly indistinguishable, and everyone was in great awe of his invention. So here we have then how this invention kind of spread around in Italy. So this work was created in the 1420s, and this was groundbreaking for its proper use of linear perspective for the very first time. So this was a bold technique that was developed by Donatello. It was a bronze panel, and this really opened a new era. The wave of perspective rushed through the world of art within a few years, and all artists, adhered to its principles, where prior to Donatello's panel, no one questioned the incorrect perspective in paintings. This was a combination of kind of an absence of worldview and technical knowledge in essence. So the rules of perspective remained unchallenged. So then we have this image. This is actually the very first work on a two-dimensional scale that it was represented with. So this became an integral part of Quattrocento art. So not only was perspective a way of showing depth, it was also a new method for composing a painting. And paintings began to show a single unified scene rather than a combination of several. So here you have this work by Masaccio, and this shows the artist's understanding of Brunelleschi's new architecture of science and perspective. And so it is the earliest example of rational space in painting, and for the first time in history, we're given all the data needed to measure the depth of a painted interior, to draw its plan, and to duplicate the structure in 3 dimensions. So in addition to the spatial organization and illusion of depth and the structural focus, perspective can also provide a narrative focus. So since the eye invariably travels to the vanishing point of a structure or of a picture, Renaissance artists did not hesitate to put something important near or at that point. So as you can see here, where do the vanishing points lean back to? So if you follow like the lines of the sides of these buildings, you'll see that they all actually converge here at the head of Jesus. And so that really shows the importance of him in this narrative that's being depicted. And so there was a quick proliferation of accurate perspective paintings in Florence, and so you can see how Brunelleschi likely understood with the help from his friend Toscanelli, but did not publish the mathematics behind perspective. So in essence, the use of perspective stayed mainly in Italy for a good number of years. You can also, if I refer back to this slide, if you draw these perspective lines down as well, they go to the base of the cross here. Again, also a very important point in that image. So decades later, his friend Leon Battista Alberti wrote De Pittura, which was a treatise on the proper methods of showing distance in painting. So Alberti described how an artist could get a correct view of a scene by observing it through a thin veil or velo. So the idea is that we can get a correct image of some object seen through such a veil or window by tracing the outline of the object onto glass. So Albrecht Dürer designed such several machines, which are kind of interesting. So Alberti's primary breakthrough was not to show the mathematics in terms of conical projections as it actually appears to the eye. Instead, he formulated a theory that was based on planar projections, or how the rays of light passing from the viewer's eye to the landscape would strike the picture plane or the painting. So he was then able to calculate the apparent height of a distant object using 2 similar triangles. The mathematics behind similar triangles is relatively simple, having long ago been formulated by Euclid. So Alberti himself had limited himself to figures on the ground plane and giving an overall basis for perspective. So Alberti had limited himself to figures on the ground plane and giving an overall basis for perspective. And Della Francesca then fleshed it out, explicitly covering solids in any area of the picture plane. So you can see here, how the figures are large in the foreground and get smaller in the background, and this looks very naturalistic. So Della Francesca also started the now common practice of using illustrative figures to explain the mathematical concepts, making his treatise easier to understand than Alberti's. And Della Francesca was also the very first to accurately draw the Platonic solids as they would appear in perspective. And then we have Pietro Perugino's use of perspective in this fresco at the Sistine Chapel, helped bring the Renaissance to Rome. So this image is actually pretty interesting because when everyone goes to the Sistine Chapel, all they're doing is looking up at the ceiling, and these are on the side walls, and were also very, very important paintings within themselves. So perspective remained for a while just in the domain of Florence. So here you have a work by Jan van Eyck that was, they were unable to create, a consistent structure for the converging lines in paintings, in like this image here, because he was unaware of the theoretical breakthrough that was just then occurring in Italy. So he was more in the north. And then you have Leonardo da Vinci, who distrusted Brunelleschi's formulation of perspective because it failed to take into account the appearance of objects that were held very close to the eye. So he built his understanding of perspective not only upon the rigid formulations of rays of light, but what he directly observed. His understanding of perspective thus took in not only the light, but the air it traveled through. So he believed that the way an object's color seemed to change with the distance, and the way an object's borders became indistinct with distance are primary parts of perspective known as aerial perspective. Leonardo was the very first artist to show objects as less detailed in the distance. Contrast between lights and darks became less distinct in the distance, and there appears to be a bluish haze, as you can see here, beyond this portrait of the Mona Lisa. I think that's another thing that sometimes people, don't realize, is that this use of the perspective and the landscape beyond the Mona Lisa is part of what makes it such an important painting. So Leonardo believed that understanding perspective was crucial to painting and drawing, as illustrated in the following statement. He said, "Practice must always be built upon strong theory, of which perspective is the signpost and the gateway. Without perspective, nothing can be done well in the manner of painting." So there's some different varieties of perspective. So of the many types of perspective drawings, the most common categories of artificial perspective are 1, 2, and 3 point. And the names of these categories refer to the number of vanishing points in the perspective drawing. So the technique of making objects in the distance with the soft, cool colors is called aerial perspective. So there are also certain limitations. The essence of perspective is really to show things as they appear, but not as they are. So because of this, a number of problems can arise. Perspective images are calculated assuming a particular vanishing point. So in order for the resulting image to appear identical to the original scene, a viewer of the perspective must view the image from the exact vantage point used in the calculations relative to the image. So this cancels out what would appear to be distortions in the image when viewed from a different point. In the real world, vanishing points are very far apart. So if you imagine strings streaming out parallel to the edges of a cube going to a horizon, the horizon is miles away, so the vanishing points are many miles apart. But when you draw them only a few inches apart on a piece of paper, there's going to be some distortion in the image that's produced. This is very clear in this image here by Ed Ruscha. So artists actually utilize these distortions in interesting ways to produce dramatic effects in their work. So these apparent distortions are more pronounced away from the center of the image as the angle, between a projected ray from the scene to the eye becomes more acute relative to the picture plane. So in practice, unless the viewer chooses an extreme angle, like looking at it from the bottom corner of the window, the perspective normally looks more or less correct. This is referred to as Siemens paradox. There's only one point in front of a perspective drawing where its 3 mutually perpendicular vanishing points appear in mutually perpendicular directions. But such a drawing nonetheless appears realistic from a variety of distances and angles. So it's not like you have to stand in front of a board with a hole drilled through it to see this image correctly. And so that's the paradox, is that the fact that it seems natural even if you're not looking at through it from that one single point. So it's been suggested that a drawing in perspective still seems to be in perspective at other spots because we still perceive it as a drawing because it lacks depth of field cues. So what is it that caused this invention of linear perspective and its use in art at the time? So linear perspective resulted from an interest in optics, which had also been explored by the Greeks. Therefore, the revival of classical ideas with the Renaissance helped to spur this invention, and the invention of linear perspective remained in Florence for some time until this information was able to be disseminated with the advancement of the invention of the printing press. So the invention of perspective gave artists the ability to create the illusion of naturalistic three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional painted surface for the very first time in history. So to define linear perspective, this is a scientific method of determining the correct placement of forms in space to the degree to which such forms appear to diminish in size at a given distance. The principles of the system were formulated early in the 15th century by Italian Renaissance artists seeking a logical means for creating unified, measurable space. So in Brunelleschi's study, vision was restricted to a precise fixed point of view. Thus, linear perspective is based on a fixed point of view. So the rules of linear perspective, as I mentioned, are dependent on this single fixed point of view, but in fact, we almost never see anything under that condition. So even when we hold our heads in a fixed position, our eyes are almost always constantly in motion. Perspective drawing in theory demands that you not shift the position of your head nor the direction of your gaze. And all that can be seen without moving your eyes is contained within a cone of vision. So in perspective drawing, as the viewer is elevated higher than the ground level, the horizon line rises on the picture plane to reveal more of the ground. The closer to the ground level, the lower the horizon line. So it is the artist who determines the eye level, and the viewer has no choice but to accept it. So if you think about what the horizon line is, this indicates, where the eye and the earth, sky and the earth would meet, if there was nothing kind of blocking your view. So it also corresponds to the eye level of the viewer. So most often there is something in the way. There's like mountains or trees or buildings or whatever. So just think of it most often as that eye level of the viewer when you're creating these drawings. So the other aspect of perspective is the vanishing point, which is very important. So this is the place in one point, or places, which for 2-point perspective, and these are located on the horizon line. They're always located on the horizon line, which is the eye level, as you remember. And this is where, parallel lines seem to converge in space. So objects that are placed parallel to one another use the same vanishing points, and objects set at different angles from each other have their own vanishing points. So with 1-point perspective, this is a system for depicting three-dimensional depth on a two-dimensional surface dependent upon the illusion that all parallel lines that recede into space converge at a single point on the horizon, called the vanishing point. So 1-point perspective seems most effective when the central vanishing point is placed near the center on the horizon line. So basically what this is saying is that you're sitting directly in front of or centered on the objects that you're drawing or viewing. So this works best, like, for instance, like looking down a long hallway when you're kind of just directly face on that element that's receding into space, or even when you're, in the car on the road, you look forward as you're driving, and you see the edges of the road recede to one point. So remember, you're sitting directly in front of the subject. There's one point at which the lines recede into the distance, and this point is always located on the horizon line, and the horizon line equals your eye level. Vertical edges are shown as vertical lines. Horizontal edges are shown as horizontal lines. Edges that recede are on the lines that converge at the vanishing point on the horizon line. So note that these same three, and only these three kinds of lines, are used to draw the cubes, regardless to where they are located in the picture. So also note the cube to the left, while technically correct, appears distorted. So 1-point perspective only depicts objects near the vanishing point with accuracy. So remember, you're sitting directly in front of your subject. There is one point at which the lines recede into the distance, and this point is located on the horizon line, and the horizon line equals your eye level. So then we go to two-point perspective, and this is a system for depicting three-dimensional depth on a two-dimensional surface, and is dependent upon the illusion that all parallel lines converge at 2 points on the horizon line. So two-point perspective is used when you're sitting at an angle to your subject, like at the corner. So again, the horizon line equals your eye level, and both vanishing points lie on this horizon line. Only the verticals remain parallel to the picture plane, and all other lines recede to one vanishing point or the other. So again, there are only 3 different kinds of lines you need to draw in a two-point perspective drawing. So vertical edges are always drawn as vertical lines. Edges of sides that recede toward the right are on the lines, converging on the right vanishing point, and edges that recede towards the left on lines converging at the left vanishing point. So both of the cubes in this example use only these 3 same kinds of lines. So you can see the top of the cube below the horizon line, your eye level, and the bottom of the cube above the horizon line. More of its left side because it is to your right of the position of the center of the vanishing points, and you also see more distortion occurring if the object is close to one or other of the vanishing points. So as I mentioned before, in the real world, vanishing points are very far apart. Imagine strings streaming out parallel to the edges of a cube going to the horizon. The horizon is miles away, so the vanishing points are many miles apart. And when you draw them only a few inches apart on your piece of paper, there's going to be some distortion in the image produced, as you can see here, like I mentioned before. And so if you take a look at this interior image, this also works as well. Thinking about your eye level as the horizon line, even though you don't see anything of the outdoors or the sky and the earth, it still works in perspective. They're just kind of crisscrossed to show the interior of the room, with one line going back this way and this line going back this way to the other point. As you can see, this crisscrossing that happens. The next type of perspective is called atmospheric perspective, and this is also called aerial perspective. Atmospheric perspective deals with how the appearance of an object is affected by looking at it through a layer of air. Moisture, dust, and pollutants in the atmosphere act to filter the visual information. So this is most apparent on a foggy day when it may be difficult to see across the street. So even in the clear, dry air of a desert, the atmosphere changes the appearance of distant objects. So contrast is greater for close objects. Distant objects have less contrast in them and less to their surroundings. Each row of hills receding into the distance has less contrast with the next. And remember that the value contrast is the strongest contrast when creating spatial illusions. So colors also change with depth. All of the colors are clear on near objects. Bright colors are only seen on those close objects, and warm colors also show up more on near objects. As objects get farther away, the colors dull and eventually turn a blue-gray. Partially because of this, warm colors appear to be closer than cool colors. So the focus in an image also gives depth of clues. So close objects are generally more sharply focused than distant objects, and it is possible to alter this with a camera, but the mind sees softly focused edges as being farther away than sharp edges. Details are much more apparent on near objects because of all of what I mentioned previously. So linear perspective makes more distant details too small to see, but it is low contrast that it tends to flatten distant objects. So pay attention to how these concepts play out when you're looking at a landscape. The same tree looks not only smaller in the distance, but also, less leafy, not as bright green. As the trees get farther away, they blend into the landscape, and eventually all you see are rows of hills, flat as cutouts, receding to the horizon. So this is especially true on a hazy day or when looking into the sun. Another type of perspective is called three-point perspective. So this is a system for depicting three-dimensional depth on a two-dimensional surface. And in addition to the lines that are receding to the 2 points on the horizon, there's lines that are vertical going upwards to a third vanishing point. So when we look down upon a subject from a great height or look up from a low observation point to see a form towering above us like a skyscraper, the subject's vertical lines will appear to converge toward a vanishing point. So here you can see here an example of this 3-point perspective. So other means of representing space include axonometric projection, where all lines remain parallel rather than disappearing into vanishing points. Axonometric projection is classified as being isometric, dimetric, or trimetric, depending on 1, 2, or 3 of the measurements maintaining the same scale. Thank you all for joining me today on this little bit of history tour on perspective, and I hope you've enjoyed, taking a look at some of those historical points of view and how it was discovered. And I'm looking forward to working with you on some physical drawing demos upcoming here to show you how these start to come into action. Taking a look at atmospheric perspective, 1-point perspective, and 2-point perspective, and they're really fantastic and amazing how you can make such a believable space with just following some pretty basic rules. So be sure to subscribe, and I will catch you next time.